Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In the last two podcasts, we have been dealing with the story in which David suffers the effects of his self-fulfilling prophecy. Recall that soon after David expressed his outrage about the fact that a rich man deserved to pay fourfold for his crime against a poor man, the wealthy man, of course, had robbed the poor man of his only ewe lamb to feed a guest, even though the rich man's wealth boasted of many flocks of sheep. The prophet Nathan had told David this story to David as a way of confronting the king for his own crimes. As the story unfolded, David paid a terrible price that had an impact on his adult children. His daughter was raped by his own son. The crime against the daughter was avenged by her full brother, and therefore another of David's sons. This led to David's son being estranged from him. Once that son was again in David's presence, the relationship remained strained. This condition eventuated in that son's fomenting social unrest that eventually led to David's being forced off the throne and out of Jerusalem. Absalom was the son who had taken over his father's rule. At the conclusion of the last podcast, David was in a hurry to escape from Jerusalem after he had been unseated. At this point in the ongoing story, David has a conversation with Ittai, a man who had been in David's circle of leaders. Ittai was a Gittite. Nevertheless, he remained loyal to King David, insisted on staying with the monarch as he was getting out of town. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 19 and following. David encouraged Ittai to stay in Jerusalem, but the man refused to abandon his king, so Ittai went along with David as he fled. A man by the name of Abiathar, as well as another man, Zadok the priest, along with a number of Levites, went with David. They brought the Ark of the Covenant with them, something that symbolized King David's relationship with the Israelite deity. That's in verse 24. But David ordered that the Ark needed to remain in Jerusalem. David was resigned to leave the matter in God's hands. The king reasoned that God would either make it possible for him to return to Jerusalem or would let him forego his kingship. Because of these orders, Abiathar and Zadok went back to Jerusalem with the ark in tow. Abiathar and Zadok were both accompanied by their sons. That's in verses 24 through 29. David was in bad shape. He was weeping, barefooted, and had his head covered as he continued this shameful escape. Those with him were also reeling. They were also weeping, and they also had their heads covered. This indicated lamentation and shame. Even worse, David was told that Ahithophel, who was famous for his cleverness, was among those who had conspired to bring about the coup. David was reduced to pleading to God that the deity would turn Ahithophel's advice into foolishness. That's in verses 30 through 31. But just prior to David's getting to a safe place, he made a counter move. He had run into Hushai, who had come to the king with his coat torn and dirt on his head. Both of these conditions indicated the lamentable situation. That's in verse 32. David wanted Hushai to go back to Jerusalem. That would benefit the king much more than his joining this sorry lot. David asked Hushai to go to Absalom and expressed his fealty. Once he is in Absalom's good graces, Hushai would be in position to counter any counsel that came from Ahithophel. David also reminded Hushai that Zadok and Abiathar were already in Jerusalem. By communicating with these two men, as well as their sons, Hushai could keep David apprised of Absalom's strategy. Basically, David was planting operatives in Absalom's inner circle. Hushai agreed to this plan, and returned to Jerusalem, just as Absalom was himself entering the city. That's in verses 33 through 37. David may be desperate, but has enough energy and cleverness to plant moles to address this distressing situation. Once David is on the lam, he runs into people that remind him that his kingship involved the displacement of Saul's kingship. Ziba, a servant of Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson and Jonathan's son, had a couple of asses laden with provisions. When David questions Ziba, the man allowed that he had brought these supplies for David's use. However, his master, Mephibosheth, was now angling back in Jerusalem to reinstate the house of Saul as the legitimate dynasty. That is how chaotic the political situation had become. At that point, David told Ziba that he had a right to any property belonging to Mephibosheth. Whether David had the legal right or political power to bring about such an order is dubious. Nevertheless, Ziba was thrilled at what David had said. That's the first 4 verses of chapter 16. A second incident involved Shimei, who had a previous connection with the house of Saul himself. When he got the chance, he cursed David and threw stones not only at the king, but at the king's servants. Apparently, he believed that in this weak state, David could not prevent such insolent behavior. Part of Shimei's curse was that this had all come about because God was avenging Saul, whose place David had taken. Indeed, he made sure that everyone heard his criticism that Absalom's takeover was part of this divine vengeance. That's in verses 5 through 8 of chapter 16. At this point, one of David's aides had had enough. This aide, Abishai, told David that he would put a stop to this insolence by taking off Shimei's head. But David refused to let the aide make Shimei stop his cursing. David reasoned that perhaps God had put Shimei up to this, in which case he did not want to go against the divine will. David also realized the plight he was in, for his own son was responsible for the coup. Being cursed from one previously committed to the house of Saul did not compare to being dethroned by one's own son. At least, that is what David concluded. In the end, David said, if this man had to suffer for his cursing the former king, let God do the punishing. In any case, Shimei kept on cursing David and his entourage, and continued to throw stones and dust on these hapless people. At last, David and this group arrived at their destination quite exhausted. They were able to rest a little when they got there. That's in verses 9 through 14. In the meantime, Absalom and those supporting him repaired to Jerusalem, along with the important counselor Ahithophel. Hushai, David's mole, showed up at the same time. He expressed loyalty to Absalom, but Absalom was suspicious. He knew that Hushai had been on David's side. Absalom wanted to know how Hushai gave up his loyalty to David so easily. Hushai's response was that both God and Israel had made their choice. Plus, he was loyal to the office, not necessarily to the one who held it. Absalom seemed satisfied with this answer. That's in verses 15 through 19. After this matter was resolved, Absalom turned to Ahithophel for advice. Now that they were in Jerusalem, what should the next step be? Ahithophel had a two-pronged strategy. First, he encouraged Absalom to erect a tent on the palace roof and sleep with his father's concubines. When all Israel sees this blatant display of arrogance and power, they will know that the rift between son and father has become irreparable. Absalom immediately put this part of the strategy in motion. He erected a tent, and in the presence of all Israel, made it known that he had taken over the royal harem. Of course, this scene is thick with irony, for it was from this very palace roof that David had first seen Bathsheba. This scene concludes with the narrator underscoring the fact that Ahithophel's counsel was nothing short of an oracle from God. That's how much he was trusted. So far, his strategy was working quite well. That's in verses 20 through 23 of chapter 16. The second prong of Ahithophel's strategy would involve neutralizing David. He told Absalom that 12,000 troops should be deployed. At once, these soldiers should pursue David. The king is tired and discouraged and in no condition to deal with an attack of this size. When those with David realize what they are up against, they will abandon the king immediately. Then David will be assassinated. Israel would surely prefer the death of one man over a protracted civil war and the many casualties that would result from that. Absalom liked this part of the plan as well, as did the other Israelite advisors. That's the first 4 verses of chapter 17. Then, quite inexplicably, Absalom asks for a second opinion. This is after he had already implemented the first part of Ahithophel's strategy, namely sleeping with David's concubines. Of all people, he wants to know what Hushai thinks about this part of the plan. That's in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 17. Indeed, Absalom wants to know specifically what Hushai thinks about the second part of Ahithophel's plan. Without hesitation, Hushai opines that Ahithophel's second prong is a bad idea. That's in verse 7. Hushai points out that David and those with him were experienced warriors. Not only that, the king and his soldiers are as angry as a bear robbed of her cubs and will be ready for a sneak attack. David might also have hidden himself and be difficult to find. If a struggle ensues and David manages to inflict damage on the attacking troops, word will soon spread that Absalom's forces have been badly weakened. That will induce panic. All Israel knows about David's reputation of being a great military man. Once they convince themselves that he has mounted a serious counter-move, Absalom's political support will evaporate. That's in verses 8 to 10 of chapter 17. Instead, Hushai advises Absalom to take on David directly. If Absalom musters troops from all Israel, David will be compelled to meet him in an open battle. It is important for Absalom to appear himself personally. Hushai predicts a great victory. Even if David manages to escape to another city, then Absalom's massive troops will reduce that city to rubble, and David will have no place to hide. When Absalom and those with him heard Hushai's plans, they thought that his strategy was superior to Ahithophel's. That is not transparent to the reader of the story, of course. Exposing Absalom in an open battle surely is not a better idea than having him lead the troops himself. But this was not a matter of military logic. The Lord had skin in this game. God had induced Absalom and his people to think that Hushai's plan was superior. This would allow God to punish Absalom for the coup. That's in verses 11 through 14 of chapter 17. David's having had Hushai as a mole in Absalom's inner circle, and the Lord's orchestrating what the people thought of Hushai's advice, were both decisive in what happened next. We will conclude this story in next week's podcast. Let me invite you to go to my website, faspina.com, which, by the way, is soon going to be revised and having a new look. Let me know what your email is. Also, if you have a question you would like me to deal with in a Q&A session, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.